Greetings, this is Father Harvey Henderson, St. Paul's Episcopal Church in Grand Forks. Continuing with the careful reading of Matthew's Gospel, we're approaching the climax of the story, and today in chapter 21 this week, we have the introduction of where Jesus and his disciples make this dramatic entry into the city of Jerusalem, what the Christians celebrate as Palm Sunday because of the palm branches that were laid out on the parade route, so to speak, as Jesus and his followers entered the holy city. So the last week of his life is beginning, and his conflict with the Jewish authorities is heating up, and we'll see how that happens in a minute. There's a little bit of humor at the beginning of the story. Matthew's made a bit of a mistake in copying his Old Testament source. So when they get near the city of Jerusalem, Jesus sends his disciples ahead of them so that they are to go into town and fetch the donkey upon which he is to ride. He's copying from the prophet Zechariah chapter 9 here, I think, and in the Old Testament there is this familiar use of parallelism where something is mentioned twice, but really only one thing is intended by the statement. So when the disciples are asked to fetch a donkey and a colt, Matthew has misunderstood the prophetic reading, and so they bring the two animals to Jesus. And if you have a bit of a sense of humor, you can try to picture Jesus riding upon the donkey as well as on the foal of the donkey as he enters into the city of Jerusalem. Clearly this was not the case. He rode only the donkey. And the contrast there is that he did not ride on some great war horse, which was the common expectation that many of the Jewish people had of this person called the Messiah, the anointed one by God, the one who was to rescue them from their Roman oppressors at the time of Jesus. They expected a military takeover of the city of Jerusalem and the temple in particular, and that the people of Israel would be restored to their rightful place as it was at the time of David when he and his army marched into the city of Jerusalem. So the donkey is meant to show that Jesus comes as the peaceful king, as the servant king. The donkey is a servant's animal, not a war animal, and this gives us some indication of how Jesus will conduct these last few days of his life here on earth. So we're told a very large crowd had gathered. This was the city of Jerusalem. I can't remember exactly how many people lived there about this time, but it was a large number of folks. It was a large cosmopolitan city made up of not only of Jews, but of people from a variety of ethnic backgrounds. It was a business and cultural center. And it was the time of Passover, the celebration where the Jews remember that when Moses led them out of Egypt. This was a so-called pilgrimage festival, in that Jews from wherever they were to gather 3 times a year. This was one of them, in the city of Jerusalem, to pay the temple tax and to make the appropriate sacrifices and offerings. We came across this earlier in the Christmas story when Jesus and Joseph and Mary are instructed to journey from their home in Nazareth in the north to the city of Bethlehem for this time of census and at the time of Passover. So Jerusalem at Passover has been likened to New Orleans at the time of Mardi Gras. It would have been a bit of a hectic kind of place full of crowds of people. So the crowds might have been cheering for anything, but Matthew may be tending to overestimate the importance and the notoriety of Jesus at this particular point in the story. And then he enters to the temple, and it has what some have called a bit of a temper tantrum there. Now we have to have in our minds a bit of a picture of the temple. It was a huge complex, nothing like any of our church facilities these days, more like a city square. And I think it's about the length of 12 football fields, so about 1,200 yards long, and 24 football fields wide. Again, about 1,200 yards wide, made up of different complexes with the holiest part of the temple in the middle, but with different courts walled off as a part of that particular complex. There were folks buying and selling things rather than having to bring the animal for your sacrifice from your home. You could go to Jerusalem and buy the animal there. So the buyers and sellers were offering a kind of service to people, as were the money changers. In order to pay the temple tax that each Jew was required to pay annually, you needed to use temple money. You couldn't use the money that you would use for normal trade, the imperial money of the Roman Empire at the time. So just like when we cross the border into Canada, we change the money. This is what people were doing. So Jesus certainly is angry here, and no doubt folks were not just doing fair business while they were there. They were out to make a buck any way that they could, perhaps many of them. So Jesus might well exhibit here some righteous anger at this particular thing. But this was something which really would offend the Jewish leadership in and around the city of Jerusalem. The temple priests especially were of the high class of Jewish society and very much depended upon their livelihood by the money that was taken in at the temple. So they would be very much offended by this, and almost we could see this as the last straw in terms of Jesus offending the Jewish leaders. In verses 14 and following, the reference to the blind and the lame coming to him in the temple is interesting. For a little tidbit in 2 Samuel chapter 5, David, after he enters victoriously into the city of Jerusalem, exiles the blind and the lame and forbids them from coming into the temple, if not into the city itself, because as he was besieging the city, the Jebusites, the folk who lived there, taunted David and said even the blind and the lame could defeat the armies of David. So in an act of revenge, David exiles them from the temple. We know from many of the gospel stories that these folks were often outside the temple gates. Well, here Jesus has welcomed them into the temple itself and has healed them. Again, something which would be offensive to those Jewish authorities in and around the city of Jerusalem. The curious little incident of the fig tree is just a story that Matthew remembers and sticks it in here. I'm not exactly sure what it means again, but Jesus has a temper tantrum and destroys the fig tree because it doesn't have any figs and he's hungry. What the ultimate purpose of the story is, I'm not sure, but he makes a point to his disciples about faith, and we've seen this once before, this idea of exaggeration. If you have faith enough to move mountains, not literally, obviously, and again, not literally using faith to cast a fig tree into the sea, but rather encouraging his disciples to have faith. And so while he's in the temple then, he meets the chief priests and the elders of the people, and they challenge him and ask him by what authority he is healing folks and offering this teaching, in particular the forgiveness of sins, which was part of the sacrificial system that took place at the temple precinct itself. The high priests, the priests at the time of Jesus were actually master butchers who would offer that. You can check the book of Leviticus in your spare time to see the details of many of these kinds of sacrifices for the forgiveness of sins and thank offerings and guilt offerings and all kinds of other offerings that were in business at the time of Jesus. So Jesus asks them a question: was the baptism of John from God or not? And they're in a quandary. They say if it was from God, and he'll say, why didn't you believe him? If they say it wasn't from God, they fear the crowds, which are large at this time, because John the Baptist was indeed a very popular person in and around the city of Jerusalem and in Jewish tradition in general. So they're stumped once again. The story of the two sons, a father saying to one son, go and do this, and that son says no, but then later changes his mind and does it, and says to the second son, go and do this, and that second son says yes at first and then doesn't do it. Well, which is the better son? They answer, well, clearly the first son who changed his mind and did that. And then Jesus compares them to the tax collectors and prostitutes and sinners at the time. Why don't you, the Jewish leadership, recognize and subscribe that Jesus is the promised Messiah, when many of the outsiders in society, the tax collectors, the prostitutes, women, the poor, the blind and the lame, and others, have accepted Jesus as this promised Messiah? What about you as the Jewish leadership? Likewise, I feel like I'm talking a little bit fast here. There's much to get through, but likewise, the parable of the so-called wicked tenants, that the landowner has planted a vineyard and put a fence around it, and he leased it to tenants, and then he went to another country, and when he sends his slaves to collect the produce, they kill them at one point, and then finally he sends his son, and they kill the son as well. Clearly a reference to the prophets in the first place, who came to the Jewish leaders proclaiming the kingdom of God, and then Jesus himself, and again a forecast that of his impending death here in the days ahead, as he enters the city of Jerusalem, the place of his death. So the stone that the builders rejected has become the cornerstone. This is clearly a reference to Jesus when he says earlier that he will rebuild the temple in 3 days. He's again not talking literally about rebuilding the physical structure, but that Jesus, after his death and resurrection in particular, will be the focus of worship and not the temple any longer. And this indeed comes to fruition in the year 70, when the Romans destroyed the temple for the second time. The Babylonians back in 587 BC destroyed it for the first time, but it had been rebuilt about a generation before the time of Jesus by Herod the Great, whom we met early on in the Gospel of Matthew. He's the one who tried to kill the baby Jesus and sent the wise men to look for him, and then killed all the young children in and around the city of Bethlehem. Jesus is talking about himself. He becomes the place. And Matthew's writing, again, about the mid-80s of the first century. So he already knows that the temple has been destroyed, and clearly sees this as a sign from God that the old ways are done of the temple worship, and that Jesus is the new way, and the Jewish leadership ought to get on board with this. This is a common theme I've mentioned throughout the Gospel of Matthew, is the conflict between Jesus and the Jewish authorities, and wanting to remember that it's not with all of the Jewish people, but rather mostly the high priests and the upper classes of Jewish society, whose livelihoods are threatened by the authority of Jesus. But certainly not all of the Jewish people can be blamed for the death of Jesus, as Christians have sometimes mistakenly done, sadly, throughout our history. So the conflict is heating up here, and we know in the days ahead what will happen with the Last Supper and the arrest and the trials of Jesus before the Roman and Jewish authorities. So the chapter 21 closes like this. The chief priests and the Pharisees were these, we might call them religious fundamentalists, realized that Jesus was speaking about them when he was talking about these wicked tenants, and they set it out. They wanted to arrest him, but they feared the crowds. You see, Jesus was, like John the Baptist, was very popular with the crowds at the time. Now we know the story of how the Jewish leaders rile up the crowds at the time of of the crucifixion, but right here early on, at least, they are in fear of the crowds at this time of Passover, and are mostly in fear of their Roman leaders. The Jews don't want any trouble in and around the city of Jerusalem, especially at Passover, because the Romans then would clamp down on any kind of freedom that the Jewish leadership had as long in the city at the time. As long as things went well, the Romans didn't much care about the Jews practicing their religion. They were mostly tolerant as long as there wasn't any trouble. So next week, a couple of familiar the parable of the wedding feast, which we find only in the Gospel of Matthew. So hope you're well. Take care, and God bless.